I will continue talking about the creation of man, focusing on how God created human beings according to each of both narratives. Genesis 1, the priestly tradition, and Genesis 2, the Theistic tradition, and try to take out or extract the idea or the ideology behind that narrative. You need to know that in antiquity, people did not write stories in order to inform other people what happened in the past. So in that sense, the writing of history was only the making of kings who wanted to have other generations remember what they had done. But sacred texts such as those two narratives, they were composed to help people understand why life is the way it is. They were written as an instruction. So basically they were not written to merely inform people, but to help them orient themselves in the world they live in. And of course, especially when it comes to the Theistic story, which is a story of creation and fall, this story was composed to tell people why the world is so broken, why there is pain, why there is war. Because these are basic human questions that need to be answered. And so, especially when it comes to the second story is designed in a very interesting way. Human beings live their life at the crossroad of two vectors. One is the horizontal, which is history. This is what happens every day on the historical plane. But then there's another vector, which is something that we call spiritual reality, but in technical terms that would be meta-history. In other words, these are the spiritual processes that shape history. So there's a spiritual realm in which certain processes work all the time, and they shape history. History goes like this, and meta-history always accompanies it. Pardon my Greek. Okay? So at any given point of history, the spiritual reality, God and the spiritual reality is with us. It moves with us. Right? So in a way, it is a mistake to believe that Genesis 2, the Theistic story of creation and fall, is only there to inform us of what happened in history. This story is not written to tell us only what happened in history. Genesis 2 is the creation of man, and Genesis 3 is the fall. This story is to tell us about things that are part of the spiritual reality, part of the spiritual dynamics that shape human life. I will give you an example to make you understand that better. The name Adam. Now remember, in the priestly tradition, the male is nameless. God doesn't give him a particular name, but He gives a name to the man He creates in the beginning of the Theistic story. And Adam is usually translated as man. Okay. But man, is this a private name of a private individual, of an individual? Is it? Well, we all call him Adam, so it must be a private name, right? Yet, this is a private name that is the name of all that come out of Adam. So this name applies not only for the first individual God created, but for everyone that follows, that comes out of Adam. Because every person that will come after Adam will come out of Adam. So in that sense, Adam is himself, but us at the same time. And Adam's story is not a private story. It is the story of humanity. Because whatever happens with him, happens with us. So in that sense, the story is inclusive. Inclusive. That means this, that when you read the story, the idea is not that you would be merely informed about what happened to the first couple, but you'll be involved into this story and see yourself in it. See yourself as a man who was created in the wasteland and brought into a good, well-ordered garden. A man who heard God to say, there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong. And if you go off limits, you will die. If you violate what I'm telling you, you will die. So out of curiosity, out of rebellion, out of stupidity, out of whatnot, we cross the lines and we die. We're chased out of the place where we're created to be, and we wander miserable, knowing that God has cursed us, and that there is a place that we need to return to, that we dream of, that was our home, but we lost it. So basically, this story is designed not only to inform people about history past, but to inform them about present, about their own lives, about their affairs, to help them to orient where are they in relationship to God. It's a phenomenal story that explains not only the historical, but also the meta-historical, the spiritual reality of our state of being. Where are we in respect to God, and why are we wandering miserably, dreaming of paradise? And why is paradise lost? So Adam is an inclusive personality. He is himself and us at the same time. Not only that, but this whole deal about the garden being called Eden is also interesting. Eden, all the biblical scholars agree that the word Eden, Eden, in Hebrew, is a Babylonian term. It's a Babylonian word, foreign to the Hebrew language. And this word means bliss, or state of happiness. So basically, the garden is not just a physical place somewhere, not just. It used to be. But it's a symbolic place in which human beings are united with God and each other. And not only with God and each other, but with the whole creation around them. So basically, Eden is a symbolic place of blissful happiness and an experience of total harmony with oneself, with God, with the other, and all forms of life. So basically, you need to know that Eden was not just a place like a very fancy garden with palm trees and blooming flowers and all kinds of beautiful animals and birds and everything put together in a harmony and all that. Eden was a spiritual state of being, a spiritual place where the heart of a man feels united with God and in harmony with all. Now think of this. It's amazing what love does to human beings. Love is like a drug. How many of you have been in love? You know, when you're in love, you're in the same space, but this space feels very different. Right? Wherever you go with the one you love, your love for the other colors everything, enhances the colors. Everything is beautiful, everything is harmonious. Your heart is excited about life. There's no clouds on the sky, right? And whenever difficulty comes, you have an incredible power to overcome it, right? That's what love does. Why? Because love is a spiritual paradise we enter. Okay? That makes us feel different. It doesn't change the place. It changes the way we perceive reality. Okay? So it's very important for me to tell you that this story is composed not only to inform us about what happened in history, but to help us orient ourselves in the reality the way it is. So whenever you unite with God, whenever your heart is in oneness with God, whenever you are in harmony with Him, then your small house becomes paradise. Then your difficult relationship with your wife becomes harmonious. Then it's not difficult to educate or to love your children. Then you enjoy your miserable work. Then you live happily with the little that you have. Why? Because your heart unites with God. It comes back to its paradise, to its Edenic bliss, because paradise is not only here, it's here as well. It's a state of being. It's a spiritual state that we should not lose, that we should always look for, because we cannot find Eden in the plane of history, but we can find it in the Spirit. It's a place that exists, especially for those who are in Christ. Of course, the book of Revelation tells us about one final paradise, and I will tell you about it a little later, but now we're talking about human beings and the way we are created. We're created to be gods, and when we're in union with God, we are in paradise. And I'll say something very important that I would like you to write down. God is our paradise. To be with God is to be in paradise. And think about this. Jesus was tempted for 40 days in the desert. But you know, this desert was paradise for Jesus, because He was at one with His Father, and there was nothing that could disturb Him. And think about this. According to Mark, right there in the desert, like no other place, the angels were serving Him. He was one with heaven, and he would see all these heavenly beings coming up and down, serving Him, attending to His needs. Well, He's fasting, He's not eating, He's not drinking. He's wandering around. What can they do for Him? I will tell you what can they do for Him. They can give Him divine revelations. They can give Him comfort. They can bring Him news from the Father. These are man's greatest needs in life. So amazingly enough, Jesus enters the desert to unite Himself with God and show us that even desert-like places are paradise when we're with God. So the story of Eden is not just about some kind of a garden that existed in the beginning that we lost and we can never find because it disappeared once and for all. It's a state of being. Okay, enough said about this. Well, a few words about human nature. According to the Yahwistic story, and I will come back to this as well, according to the Yahwistic story, we are made out of the ground. So in that sense, we are earthly. We are earthly. And because we're earthly, we understand well the processes of nature. Because we share common nature with the trees and with the animals. God made the trees grow out of the ground. He created all the animals out of the ground from the same composite material from which we are built. So in that sense, we are united with nature ontologically. We're of the same essence. We're of the same nature. Now, can we be the kings of nature without being one with nature? It's impossible. It is impossible. And you see, this story that Adam is out of the ground is very significant. I'll tell you why. Because Adam represents the earth and all forms of life on earth. He's the representation. He's the face of the earth. He's the face. Through Adam, the earth and earthly existence receives a face, receives a mind, self-consciousness. And you know, because Adam is of the earth and represents the earth, he can be the priest of the earth. The priest of the earth. Now, this is very interesting moment. Very, very interesting moment. Genesis 1 is the priestly story of creation, but interestingly enough, the Yahwistic story contains priestly elements within itself as well. And what do we mean exactly? Well, when God created Adam, He put him in the garden with the following purposes. They're stated in chapter 2. Verse 15 of Genesis 2, it says that God placed Adam in the garden so that he can cultivate it or work it and care for it or protect it. Cultivate and protect. These are two priestly terms. But before I explain what I mean when I'm saying priestly terms, I need to know what it means for real in the life of a shepherd or a person who brings out crops from the land. Well, there was enough trees that bear fruit. And Adam didn't have to do much to have these trees bear fruit, right? But most likely in the garden there were vegetables. All the vegetables we knew should have been there. But now vegetables, differently than fruits, do not grow by themselves. They need cultivation. So he was supposed to be a gardener. And now, what to protect it from? This is an interesting question. One can say, well, the world was perfect, you know, not perfect, it was a wasteland, and just piece of it was an oasis. So Adam had to protect it from the natural decay. And there are extra biblical stories. The rabbis would say that Adam had to protect his crops from the animals because they would graze everything that they find. He had to protect the fruits from the birds, and he had to protect the vegetables from the cattle. So there was work involved, quite a lot of work. So if you think that Eden was a place where you go lazy forever, you probably have read the Quran and not the Bible. The Bible talks about blissful work, joy of the fruits of your labor. That is God's blessing for Adam. Adam was a worker who was supposed to work joyfully, blissfully, enjoying the fruit of his labor. Because there was nothing that would compromise his crops, nothing that would compromise his ability to cultivate. And remember later on, when we talk about the curses, we'll find out that he was cursed to experience a new sort of labor, very differently than what he was initially blessed with. Initially, he was blessed to feel bliss while working. But after that, he was cursed to sweat and get tired. And he was cursed with the fact that the land will be ungrateful. That the land that he cultivates will disobey and bring him thorns and thistles. And the land will respond to Adam just as Adam responded to God. Will be disobedient. You read what you saw. That's the story. Okay, so why do we have the right to say that Adam was the priest of the garden, and in that sense the priest of all creation? Because the Hebrew words cultivate and protect are used later on in the priestly tradition. And to cultivate related to the sacrificing. To work, to labor for God in the priestly tradition related to the work of the sacrifice. Even today we use the work of the gospel in English-speaking countries. The work of the gospel. It's quite a work to preach the gospel, right? So basically, within the idea of Adam taking care of the garden, is the idea that Adam was a priest who was supposed to offer sacrifices to God. And protection relates to the idea that the priests, they were supposed to protect the divine truths, divine revelation. They were the guardians of the divine truths. And you can read the conversation of the angel of the Lord with the high priest Yeshua, in the book of Zechariah chapter 3. Just write it down somewhere here. Zechariah 3, and see what are the promises that the angel of the Lord is giving to the high priest, who, by the way, is the first high priest who enters the Holy of Holies to either sanctify the new temple that is built after the Babylonian exile, or probably he is inside of the Holy of Holies in the Day of the Atonement. But there you have a conversation between the angel of the Lord, who embodies the presence of God, and the high priest. And God allows him to lead his people and to protect or guard the temple and the temple knowledge. So in that sense, we realize that there is a hint to the idea that Adam was considered to be a high priest, and that Eden was a temple. Eden was a temple. Was that the sign for break, by the way? No? No? Okay. A little later, when I start telling you about the temple, I will make very clear the connection between temple and Eden. But for now, just to let you know that there are a few things that make it very clear. For example, if you take Genesis 2, verse 10, we read the following. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first was Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. Now, verse 13. The name of the second river is Gihon. Goes through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris. And the fourth is called Euphrates. So we know about Tigris and Euphrates, right? We don't know anything about Pishon, but we know something about Gihon. Now, follow the text and you'll find out that according to this story, if this is Eden, right here in the middle of the garden, or somewhere around the garden, could be out of the garden, but very close to it, there is one river that splits in 4. One is called Tigris, another Euphrates, another Pishon, and another Gihon. And they go out of the garden into different lands that are mentioned by name. So we know Tigris. We know Euphrates. I'm not sure I spelled names correctly. Tigris. Tigris. Anyway, it's too difficult to spell. Tigris, Euphrates, Pishon, and Gihon. We know these 2 rivers. Babylon is right here. Nineveh is not far from there. These are the 2 great rivers of Mesopotamia. As I said, we know nothing of Pishon, but we know something of Gihon. Now, there's no place on earth where these 4 rivers come together and are one. There's no such place. And the people who wrote that story knew it very well, because they could orient themselves in the world they live. So again, they were making references to historical reality, but their story is more than history. It goes beyond that. He is making something out of history. So it is both historical, but also not historical. Because there is no place where these 4 rivers come together. And now, do you know what is the amazing thing? The amazing thing is Gihon. Gihon is the only water source that supplies Jerusalem with water. So Gihon flows out of Jerusalem. It becomes a little brook. It's outside of the eastern walls. Flows out. It is a little brook. And in the days of Hezekiah took the water from Gihon, made a way underneath the city walls, and brought the water of Gihon in a place that was called Siloam. So that is the water source, that is the spring that supplies all of Jerusalem with water. And Gihon, my friends, is the place where King Solomon was anointed as a king. And from there, he was put on his father's mule, and he was brought into Jerusalem by the military that was accompanying him, by the high priest and the prophet Nathan. And there he was confirmed to be the next king of Israel, who was chosen by David. So Gihon was a place of anointing kings. And again, it is intimately related to Jerusalem because that's the only water source of Jerusalem. So basically, the storytellers here are telling the readers something that they can connect with. And they knew that the story of paradise related to the Jerusalem and something more particular to the temple. Paradise had to do with Zion. Paradise had to do with the temple. Adam was a high priest. And so much later analysis of that story that is not Jewish basically came to the conclusion that this story was written and put together to tell us or to explain to us in a new way why the people of Judah were exiled in Babylon. Losing their temple, the high priests were like Adam, who was kicked out of his garden into the wasteland of Babylon. So basically, this is an explanation of a present story through the light of a memory of a story past. This is very common with the Jews. They will explain present circumstances in the light of something they remember from the past. So, basically, the story of the loss of Eden becomes also the story of the loss of the temple. Now, we'll talk a lot about God's desire to build a kingdom of priests. But it's all embedded in this idea that Eden was a temple and that Adam was a high priest. Now, you'll say the following. You might say the following. Well, how come Adam is a priest since there was no sin and there was no need for sin offering? And the answer is, human beings are created to be priests of God. And their priesthood does not necessarily have to deal with sin. Because to be a priest is a life of obedience and life of thankfulness and gratitude to God, in which you offer before God everything that is fruit of your labor. You become a priest every time you break the bread at your table and give a prayer of thanks to God who made you able to bring this bread on the table. And that is the prayer for all the goods of the earth, for all the crops of the earth, are bloodless sacrifice. They're sacrifice of gratefulness, of thankfulness. You need to understand that in the priestly law, more than half of the sacrifices were bloodless sacrifices. They're offerings of the first fruits, they are libations, which means offering of all kinds of liquids like water, like olive oil, like wine, and everything that is juicy, so to say. Offering it to God as a gratitude that God has granted people good harvest, good grape harvest, good year generally. So priesthood does not necessarily have to do with offering of blood for sin. Now, the offering of blood for sin is by necessity, because human beings fall. And although they maintain their priestly call, now they have to include new kinds of sacrifices that were not provisioned in the beginning. Blood of animals. Why? Because God would cover the nakedness of the high priest with the skin of an animal that had to be killed as a result of his disobedience. And that's why Adam would lose his temple, but he would not lose his priestly call. And outside of the garden, he would still have to be a priest who offers sacrifices. But this time, not only crops of the field, but also animals of the flocks. And that's why Cain's sacrifice would not be acceptable. Why? Because it would not be sufficient. It would not be sufficient because it will not correspond with reality the way it is. And the reality the way it is for Cain and Abel is fallenness, living outside of the garden. Reality of sin, lust, decay, death. And that's why the crops of the field might be sufficient for Adam's sacrifices in the garden. But now that he's outside of the garden and lives the reality of his own sin, he has to keep covering himself with the blood of animals. That is why Abel's sacrifice is adequate, because it corresponds with the way human life, the state of human life outside of the garden.